At some point, most adults start keeping score against a schedule they never agreed to. There's a quiet panic that runs underneath a lot of adult life. It rarely gets named out loud, but it's there when you scroll, when you're at a dinner, when you see what someone you went to college with is doing now. The panic is the feeling of being behind on career, behind on purpose, behind on clarity, behind on the life you thought you'd have put together by now. And the strange thing about that feeling is how often it has almost nothing to do with our own actual life and almost everything to do with a timeline that you absorbed somewhere along the way. Maybe from culture, from parents, from LinkedIn, maybe from the version of yourself you were at 22. A timeline you never exactly agreed to, but are now quietly being graded against. That timeline is the problem, not your pace. Here's the myth: there's a correct sequence. Figure out who you are by your early 20s. Get a career on a rising curve by your late 20s. Hit financial stability and a settled identity in your 30s. Reach mastery, meaning, and impact in your 40s. Be wise by your 50s. Yeah, almost nobody actually lives like that, but most of us grade ourselves as if we should. The timeline myth treats human development like it's a project plan. Hit the milestones in order, on schedule, and you win. Fall behind, and you're failing. But becoming a person is not a project plan, it's something else. Real adult development is uneven. It moves in phases, plateaus, reversals, and sometimes long, quiet stretches where nothing visible is happening, but something important is being sorted out underneath. There are kinds of clarity that don't become available until you've lived long enough to earn them. You can't shortcut the experience that teaches you what you actually value, what you're actually good at, and what kind of life fits who you actually are. Some understandings take time, and some understandings take difficulty. That doesn't mean that delay is always wise. It doesn't mean that drift is developmental. Time alone doesn't grow you. What grows you is honest contact with your own experience, and honest contact often takes longer than the timeline allows for. Comparison is one of the main ways people stop growing in their own direction. When you measure your interior against someone else's exterior, you start optimizing for all the wrong variables. You chase visible markers like titles and salaries, followers, and milestones because they're the easiest things to compare. And you quietly stop paying attention to what you actually want, what you actually find meaningful, and what your own arc is trying to do. This is how people end up with impressive lives that don't feel like theirs. The metrics were met, the timeline was held, the self got left behind. So here's what the late bloomer label gets wrong, even when it's meant kindly. It still treats the early bloomer timeline as the default and positions you as a sort of a gentler version of behind. The word late smuggles the myth back in. The more honest reframe is this: there is no single bloom. Some people find their direction early because their direction happened to be close to what their environment was already pointing them toward. Others find it later because their real direction required them first to live out and then release a direction that wasn't actually theirs. That's not late. That's an arc that needed its first act before the second one could be written honestly. A woman builds what looks from the outside like an ideal career through her 30s. At 41, she realizes the career was her father's ambition rewired into her own resume. The next 10 years are rebuilding around what is actually hers. She doesn't start over, she starts for real. A man retires comfortably at 58 and discovers that the identity he'd been running on for 3 decades was mostly a role. The inner work he starts at 60 is the most honest work of his life. Not a consolation prize, not too late, the part that was waiting. A writer publishes a first real book at 52. After 20 years of drafts nobody saw. The voice in that book couldn't have existed at 32. It needed the losses and the quiet and the failed versions to become what it is. None of these are exceptions to a rule. They are the rule, better understood. Early achievement and mature development are two different things. Sometimes they overlap, often they don't. A person can hit every milestone on schedule and still be unformed inside. A person can look on paper like they're behind and be doing the actual work of becoming. Visible progress is not the same as real formation. Borrowed milestones are not the same as self directed growth. Being on schedule is not the same as becoming in truth. This is also not a license for drift. There's a real difference between a life that's unfolding in its own direction and one that's quietly avoiding direction entirely. The test isn't how fast you're moving. The test is whether the direction is actually yours, whether you can describe in your own language what you're growing toward and why. So if there's one thing worth taking from this, it's this: you're not behind. You're on a timeline that's yours, whether you've been honoring it or not. The question isn't how to catch up to someone else's schedule. The question is whether your life is unfolding in a direction actually yours, and whether you can stay honest with yourself about that direction as it changes. The people you secretly compare yourself to are running their own arc with their own unseen detours and private seasons of not knowing. The photograph never shows that. Yours won't either. You don't owe anyone a timeline. You owe yourself an honest direction and the patience to walk it at a pace that lets you actually become who you're becoming. Keep reading. The rest of the page goes deeper into self-knowledge, a compass for growth, and why development across lifetime is better understood as a series of becomings than a single climb.